He hadn't spoken in months. No smiles, no tears, just existed. Noah, a 5-year-old autistic boy, was curled up in a corner of the living room when Maria, the new maid, knelt beside him and hugged him. For the very first time he laughed, and someone saw it. "What did you do to my son?" whispered Richard, the most feared CEO in Manhattan, standing frozen at the door. She just smiled, and in that moment, something happened that billions couldn't buy. Silence was broken by love. Ever felt like something simple could heal the impossible? Then this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button, like, share, and drop a comment if any scene touches your heart, because today you won't walk away untouched. High above golden Manhattan, where mirrored skyscrapers hid men who thought they were gods, Richard Stanford ended another billion-dollar meeting with a cold nod. The polished mahogany table, the leather-bound contracts, the perfectly knotted tie, everything about him screamed control. But underneath, between the lines of his firm voice, there was an old weariness, like the ghost of a life he'd buried long ago. His gold watch read 5:02 p.m. At home, his autistic son was counting seconds in silence. Richard's penthouse was a masterpiece of concrete and glass, tall, untouchable, built to impress investors and intimidate guests. But to Noah, his 5-year-old son, it was a maze with no exit. Nothing made sense there. The furniture was too sharp, the colors too dull, and no one ever looked him in the eye. Since his mother died, Noah had stopped reacting to the world, and the world, in return, stopped trying to reach him. Richard didn't know how to play, or talk, or feel. Since the funeral, he'd buried himself in spreadsheets and numbers, as if hiding behind data could spare him the pain of meeting his son's empty stare. Every attempt at connection turned into awkward silence. Noah, lost in his own universe, would walk in circles, stack toys in repetitive patterns, and murmur sounds no one could understand. To Richard, it was a language he'd never learn. That morning, something shifted, barely noticeable. As he signed a major international contract, he watched a framed photo fall from the shelf. It was an old picture. Him, his wife, and baby Noah. The cracked glass reflected everything he'd avoided for years. He picked it up quickly, as if it burned his hand, and for a long moment he just stared. For the first time in forever, the CEO delayed a meeting, without explaining why. Across the city, Noah was watching a patch of sunlight crawl across the living room wall like it was the most fascinating thing on earth. No nanny had lasted more than 2 weeks. No specialist could break through. The school had refused to enroll him. Housekeepers spoke with pity, but eventually quit. Noah wasn't violent, just unreachable. And the more it happened, the more Richard hid in the upper floors of Stanford Enterprises. Sometimes the boy would sit alone on the balcony, tiny feet dangling, watching the cars below like ants. The city buzzed, noisy, alive, but inside that penthouse, everything was mute. The only constant sound was the hum of the AC, as indifferent as the man who paid for it. Richard didn't notice, but the boy was waiting. Maybe for a voice, maybe a gesture. Or maybe just someone unafraid to sit in silence with him. At the company, everyone revered the CEO. His steel-gray eyes could slice through boardrooms like knives. He was known for cold decisions and flawless strategies. But no one knew that when he came home. He avoided looking at his own son. And when he did, it was like staring into a mirror of everything he'd lost. The luxury meant nothing when the boy slept on the floor of his mother's room, clinging to one of her old shirts. Richard saw it and pretended he didn't. One night, while walking down the dark hallway, Richard heard a sound coming from Noah's room. He stopped. It wasn't crying. It was softer, like a whispered tune. When he stepped closer, he realized the sound came from the TV playing an old cartoon. Noah wasn't watching, just listening, as if that melody was a bridge between two worlds. The father stood in the doorway for a long time, hands in his pockets, heart heavy. But he didn't go in. Deep down, Richard wanted to reach out, to hold his son, to say, "It's gonna be okay." But how could he promise that, when he didn't believe it himself? The thing he feared most wasn't financial ruin, it was human failure. And while the city slept, in that golden mansion of silence, two hearts beat side by side, strangers under the same roof. But the next morning, something, or someone, would finally break through the stillness. Noah spent hours walking in circles in the mansion's courtyard. Always the same spot, always the same direction, as if trying to escape something no one could see, or maybe find his way back to somewhere only he remembered. Richard sometimes watched from the window, like a guard keeping tabs on a stranger. He knew something was wrong, but didn't know what, and it tore him up inside, though he'd never show it. At meetings, he talked profits, global expansion, mergers, acquisitions. But in his mind, the image of Noah spinning in that garden never left. Noah wouldn't make eye contact, wouldn't answer when called, couldn't stand to be touched. Any attempt at closeness turned into a collapse or complete silence. And no matter how much doctors explained the autism spectrum, nothing prepared Richard for the existential cold that haunted his home. He needs routine, they said. He needs stimulation, but also safety. Richard thought hiring the best would solve it, but nothing worked. Nannies quit. Therapists got discouraged. The few staff left in the house gave up when they realized Noah didn't fit into any standard. It was like the boy lived on his own planet, and no one could land there. Deep down, Richard blamed himself for not being present, for letting his wife handle everything while he chased deals. And now it was too late. The only bridge between him and his son, his wife, had vanished without warning. Since the day she died, Noah hadn't spoken a single word. And every night, not knowing his father stood quietly at the door, the boy curled up on her rug, clutching the pillow that still held her scent. It was the housekeeper, Mrs. Alma, who suggested bringing someone new. "Someone with more heart than resume, sir," she said with a boldness few dared to show. Richard stared at her in silence, said nothing, but 2 days later he received a stack of printed resumes, all pristine, clinical, perfect, except one, handwritten, folded neatly. Name, Maria Evans. There was no recommendation letter, just a single page with crooked handwriting and scratched-out words. "I've worked as a housemaid, lost my son 5 years ago, but I still know how to care. And listen, I didn't go to college, but I understand pain." Richard almost tossed it, but for some reason he couldn't. He read it again. And again. That single page said more than any diploma ever could. The next morning, when Maria arrived at the mansion, the house seemed to shrink around her, not from fear, but from reverence. A simple woman, upright posture, tired eyes, holding an old fabric bag. In her hands, a jar of homemade cookies. "For the boy," she said. Richard didn't know what to say. He watched from above as this small figure crossed the shiny marble entrance like she carried a century's worth of memory. Noah didn't look at her. Kept walking his circle in the garden, ignoring everything else. Maria didn't push. She just sat on the bottom step of the staircase and stayed there, quiet, like she understood that noise and hurry don't open doors the way patience does. Richard, watching from the security cameras, didn't look away. For some reason, he didn't switch off the screen. For the first time, he felt there was something different in that seemingly useless gesture. And when Maria looked at the boy, not with pity, not with sorrow, but with real tenderness, Richard was hit with a memory that hurt. His wife's gaze years ago as she rocked Noah to sleep. It was the same look, the same warm silence. And that day, though none of them knew it yet, their story began to change, because sometimes all a broken heart needs is to recognize another beating in the same rhythm. Maria Evans didn't speak loudly. She didn't wave her hands or smile just to be polite. She simply was there, present. With her worn-out shoes and steady steps, she walked through the mansion like someone who understood the value of silence, not the silence of indifference, but the kind that listens before it acts. That's how she had raised her own son, through presence, not pressure, and that's exactly how now she began to exist in Noah's world. On her first day, Maria stepped into the room where the boy was stacking wooden blocks without looking at anyone. She didn't say, "Hi." She didn't try to touch him. She simply sat on the floor, at a safe distance, and began folding a small cloth she'd brought in her bag. Her movements were slow, almost hypnotic. Noah glanced at her from the corner of his eye, but kept going. Maria smiled softly, but didn't push. She knew sometimes waiting speaks louder than words. Hours went by. Maria never left the floor. When the housekeeper offered her coffee, she thanked her, but declined. "If I get up now, I'll lose the moment." Alma didn't understand, but Richard, watching from his office monitor, grew intrigued. What did this woman think she was doing? He knew strategy, battle tactics, market psychology, but this was a foreign language, a soul's code. That night, Maria gently put away Noah's toys, folding them one by one like they were fragile. She didn't sweep the floor, didn't touch the kitchen. She understood the house needed a different kind of cleaning, the kind that clears out the shadows left by absence. She left a shaky, handwritten note. "Today he looked at me for a second. Maybe tomorrow it'll be a sound." When Richard read it, he frowned, but he kept the paper, filed it in his drawer. The next morning, Maria came back with the same jar of cookies. She placed it on the floor near Noah, and again she just sat down. She hummed an old lullaby from the countryside, something her son had loved when he was little. For a brief moment, Noah stopped walking. Just 1 second. But it was enough to make Maria's heart race, and to make Richard's crack a little deeper, because he realized that this woman was reaching the son he never knew how to touch. Richard started watching the security footage in secret, late at night, before bed. He'd pause, rewind. He watched how Maria approached with respect, without rushing. How she made up stories without expecting applause. How she listened to Noah's silence like it was music. She's not trying to fix him, he thought. She's just with him. And that bothered him, because deep down he wished he could do the same. Slowly, Noah began to accept her presence. One day, he placed a toy near her lap. The next, he sat a little closer. Maria never cheered out loud. She just jotted it all down in a little notebook, like she was collecting everyday miracles. Richard found that notebook in the laundry room. There was a page titled, "Things He's Taught Me Without Saying a Word." Next to it, a crooked sketch of 2 hands, almost touching. Maria never asked about Richard's wife, never made small talk. She understood some grief deserves to be honored in silence. But when she entered the late woman's bedroom, she noticed something. Noah's toys were stacked neatly in there, as if the child still slept in that absence. Maria sat down on the floor too, closed her eyes, and prayed quietly for the woman's soul, and for the soul of the man left behind who no longer knew how to be a father. That week, Richard came home early from work. He found Maria sitting on the floor again while Noah stacked blocks. The boy looked at her, then at his father, then went back to playing. Maria didn't stand. She simply said softly, "Sometimes, to reach a child, you have to become small, too." Richard didn't answer, but in that moment, he began to hear what silence was trying to say. The week kicked off with chaos in the glass-walled offices of Stanford Enterprises. An internal data leak sent shareholders into a frenzy. Richard kept his trademark stoic demeanor, but his eyes gave away the wear. Emergency meetings, endless calls, analysts demanding answers. The empire he'd built on ice and iron started to groan under pressure, and deep down he knew The cracks were coming from within. Back at the penthouse, while the city crumbled beneath them, Maria and Noah were building silent bridges, one drawing at a time, one song a day, one glance that lasted more than 3 seconds. To anyone else it would have meant nothing, but to Richard it was unexplainable. Something he couldn't achieve with all the money in the world. Each small gesture was like a password only Maria seemed to know. And that confused him, and irritated him, and, more than anything, weakened him. In the mirror of his executive bathroom, Richard stared at his reflection with quiet contempt. The tailored suit couldn't hide the dark circles. The trimmed beard couldn't mask the emotional fatigue. He had conquered the world, but lost his essence, lost his wife, was losing his son, and now, maybe even himself. He swallowed hard, adjusted his tie, and left the room like a man putting on armor. But the real war was back home, and he didn't even know how to fight it. That afternoon, rain poured over Manhattan. Lightning slashed the sky as Richard sped through wet streets, anxious to get home. Not because of the scandal, but because of something he couldn't name. An ache, a strange urgency. He got home early, unannounced, opened the door in a rush, stepped in unseen, and heard laughter, not just any laugh, Noah's laugh, and he froze. In the spacious living room, Maria sat cross-legged on the rug, soaked from the rain she'd caught on her way back from the market. Noah was lying in her lap, smiling, holding a toy in his hands. She was humming a wordless tune. The two of them looked like they were in another world, a parallel universe of peace. Richard stood at the bottom of the stairs, breathless, and something stirred inside his chest. It was envy. It was longing. It was rage at himself for not being able to do that, for watching another human reach his son's heart with nothing but gentleness, while he, with all his wealth, remained a stranger. The CEO, the man of decisive moves, the master of strategy, had no idea what to do. He just climbed the stairs slowly, walked into his room, and shut the door. And there, alone, he cried, for the first time in years. Maria noticed he was there, but pretended not to. She knew some masks take time and courage to remove. She kept tracing little shapes on Noah's palm with her fingers. He laughed like someone discovering the world for the first time. The mansion that once felt like a prison was now gaining sound, color, movement, and it all came from a place Richard never dared to go, the simplicity of surrender. That night, Maria left another note on the kitchen table. Today he showed me a toy car and wanted me to push it. It may seem small, but when an autistic child invites you to play, it's like opening the gates to a castle. I stepped in, and he let me stay. Richard read it, sat down at the table, pressed the paper to his chest, and stayed there, motionless, while the rain kept falling outside. And something inside him slowly began to melt. The truth was hard to swallow. Richard had been hiding behind masks his entire life. The perfect businessman, the functional father, the man who doesn't feel. But inside that house, where his son was beginning to live again, those masks no longer held. And without even realizing it, he was about to watch everything fall apart, starting with what was broken inside himself. That morning, Richard walked slowly down the stairs. He wore a plain shirt, no suit, no tie, a rare sight. The house was as quiet as always, but the air felt different. He didn't head straight to the kitchen. Instead, he stopped at the doorway of the living room and watched. Noah was sitting on the floor, surrounded by scattered toys, like a little joyful mess, and right in the middle of that whirlwind, Maria, with him in her lap. It wasn't just a hug. It was a refuge. Noah laughed out loud, a light, stumbling giggle. Maria gently rocked him, whispering something in his ear. It was a living scene, warm, full of life, and because of that, painful. Richard stood there for long seconds, trying to understand the emotion burning in his chest. It felt like watching a movie he never got to star in, the role of a father. He wanted to say something, to walk in, to sit down too, but he didn't know how. So instead, he stepped back, 2 steps, went upstairs, locked himself in his office and shut the blinds. He rested his forehead against the bookshelf and took a deep breath. That moment wasn't just beautiful, it was a raw wound, because deep down he knew it was Maria who was teaching his son how to exist in the world. And he had no clue how to be part of it. At lunch, he barely spoke. He watched Maria out of the corner of his eye, almost like he wanted to resent her, but couldn't. She served Noah with ease, telling made-up stories. "This bean right here is rocket fuel," she said, and the boy smiled, nearly biting the spoon. Richard forced himself not to watch, but his throat tightened. For the first time, he felt small, in front of a woman with quiet steps and a soul heavy with life. Later, alone, he opened a box in the master closet. Inside, old photos, Noah as a baby asleep on his mother's chest, a shot of himself holding the boy, pretending he knew how, and one last photo, all of them together at the hospital, the day Noah was born. His wife was smiling, sweaty, eyes glossy with tears. Richard wore a suit, cell phone still in hand. He didn't even remember saving that moment. But there it was, him stuck in the role of provider and absent as a man. The day ended with Maria telling a story on the couch. Noah laid his head in her lap without asking. Richard watched from afar, like always. But this time, something broke. He walked into the kitchen, grabbed a glass of water, and stopped. He heard the boy laugh again, different from that morning, freer, longer, like someone unafraid to be happy. And in that moment, Richard couldn't take it. He climbed the stairs without looking back. In the bedroom, he knelt beside his wife's empty bed, ran his hand over the untouched sheets, and then broke down. No sound, no witnesses, just hot tears, years in the making. In that moment, he wasn't the CEO, not the powerful man, just a father who'd failed, a widower who never figured out how to start again, and a man finally admitting he didn't know how to love. Maria heard the muffled sounds upstairs. She didn't ask. She lifted Noah in her arms, wrapped him in a soft blanket, and turned off the main light. Only the lamps remained on, soft, warm. Richard, meanwhile, fell asleep right there, still kneeling beside the bed, and when morning came, dry tears marked his face. But so did a sliver of air, as if at last the first crack had formed in the concrete within him. And so began what he'd never dared to name, a grief interrupted, a guilt unraveling, and maybe, just maybe, a second chance. What Richard didn't know yet was that sometimes a single word can shatter even the deepest foundations. In the days that followed, Richard started postponing meetings on purpose. He left later, came home earlier. He lingered in the mansion's hallways like someone eavesdropping on a secret, watching, silently, the growing bond between Maria and Noah. Every scene was a glimpse of something he didn't know existed. Colored notes on the fridge, hand-drawn in pencil, toys paired in perfect little sets, a soft melody playing from a small speaker in the corner of the room. Maria seemed to know exactly what to do, without a manual. She whistled old songs while she cooked, sang the names of objects around the house like it was a game. Plates gonna fly, cups gonna dance. And Noah followed, laughed, copied some gestures. Sometimes he just watched her as if she spoke a secret language only he understood. From the top of the stairs, Richard didn't know if he was witnessing a miracle or a heartbreaking loss. One afternoon, coming home early, he saw Maria and Noah sitting on the balcony floor. She was drawing on the tiles with chalk. He mimicked the shapes. Then, in a shy gesture, Noah rested his head on her shoulder. Maria said nothing, just closed her eyes. Richard froze. It hit him like a punch he didn't see coming. His breath caught, his chest tightened. It was trust, it was surrender, and it had never been given to him. That night, Richard tried to replicate it. He sat on the floor beside his son, picked up a few wooden blocks, stacked them, waited. Noah looked at him, but didn't move closer, just stared, like he was sizing up a stranger who'd stepped into his space. Richard forced a smile, held out a toy car. Noah looked away. It hurt more than he was ready to admit, and it made him back off. In his office, he opened a bottle of expensive whiskey, but he didn't drink. He just spun the glass in his hand, staring at the city lights through the window. He felt like he was losing again, that it was too late, that Maria had taken a place that should have been his, and maybe never would be. Pride wrestled with grief. Shame hit harder than frustration. And in the middle of it all, a quiet fear grew, that he wasn't needed. The next morning, Maria left a plain envelope on the table. Inside, a drawing made by Noah. Childish lines forming three figures, a woman, a boy, and a man with long arms. Above it, written in crooked letters, "Home." Richard stared at it for minutes. It was the first time his son had drawn the three of them. No labels, no names. But it was clear. It was a silent declaration. And at the same time, a plea. Richard felt a lump in his throat. He took the drawing to his late wife's bedroom and placed it inside an old frame that still stood there. When he came back, he saw Maria smiling in the hallway. They didn't speak. They just looked at each other. And in that silence, there was something the CEO still couldn't quite decode, but somehow it started to quiet the chaos inside him. By the end of that day, Richard called the office and cancelled a business trip. He simply said, "I've got something more important to take care of," and hung up before they could reply. For the first time, he threw on an old hoodie, went down to the living room floor, and stayed there. Didn't know what to do. He just stayed. Maria walked in and saw him. She smiled just a little, and Noah slowly walked over, placed a toy near Richard's leg, then ran off. It was just a gesture, nothing more. But to Richard, it meant everything. In his mind, one sentence echoed, "True love doesn't need translation." And in that instant, the powerful CEO began to understand that maybe the way to his son wasn't through strategy, but through presence. And what he couldn't possibly know was that the next day, one single word would change everything, forever. It was a soft, sunny afternoon in Manhattan, and the light spilled through the living room window like a golden sheet draped over the furniture. Maria was sitting on the rug with Noah, surrounded by children's books she'd brought from the local library. She was making up a story about gentle dragons who cried out of longing and protected quiet children. Noah stared at her mouth, as if the words had color, scent, and movement. Richard, still in his suit, had come home early without making a sound. He leaned against the wall, just behind the doorway, where he could see without being seen. His eyes locked on his son. His fingers trembled inside his pocket. He refused to interrupt. This was too rare, too precious. Noah wasn't moving, just listening, and for the first time he seemed present, connected. Richard's heart pounded so loud he was afraid the boy would hear it. Maria kept going, and even though the dragon couldn't fly like he used to, he spread his wings just to protect the little boy. And then, out of nowhere, Noah turned to her. His lips trembled, his eyes fixed on hers, and he whispered, like crossing an entire ocean with just one word, Mommy. The world stopped. Time, sound, even the air, everything froze in a moment that felt endless. Maria's eyes widened. A tear rolled down her cheek. She tried to smile, but her voice broke. Noah, unaware of the emotional earthquake he'd caused, simply looked back at the book. Richard took a step back. The pain struck his chest like a silent hammer. It was the first word his son had spoken in years, and it wasn't Daddy. Maria held back the tears. She ran her hand gently through the boy's hair and whispered, "I'm right here, sweetheart." She didn't correct him, didn't say she wasn't his mom. She knew in that moment the feeling mattered more than the label. But when she looked up, she saw Richard standing in the corner. His eyes were wet, not with jealousy, not with anger, but something deeper, like a mirror shattered between who he was and who he never managed to become. Richard said nothing. He just gave a slight nod, like a man taking a hit and saying thank you for it. Then he left the room in silence, went into the bedroom, kneeled beside his wife's bed and whispered, "He called for you." And she answered. It was a quiet, bleeding kind of pain, because it wasn't about competition. It was grief, a reckoning, and a truth too heavy for a man who had built castles on pride. Downstairs, Maria finished the story as if nothing had happened. But her voice trembled. Noah rested his head on her shoulder again, and that little gesture spoke louder than 1,000 words. He had chosen her, not to replace his mother, but because he had found something else there, an emotional home. That night, Richard didn't eat, didn't read reports. He just stared at the wall until morning broke, and by sunrise he had made a decision no one, not even himself, expected. A drastic choice, cold, painful, but deep down, the greatest act of love a man like him knew how to give. The next morning, the mansion was quieter than usual. Not peaceful, heavy, a silence full of things left unsaid. Richard came down the stairs in a dark suit, spotless, expression unreadable. Alma, the housekeeper, saw it immediately. That wasn't the father or the grieving husband. That was Mr. Stanford, the man of contracts, of final decisions. Something in him had gone cold again. Maria was in the kitchen, flipping animal-shaped pancakes like she did every morning. Noah sat at the table, smiling slightly as he played with a piece of raw dough. Richard approached slowly, looked at the scene for a moment, and cleared his throat. "Maria, can I speak with you in the office?" His voice was flat, formal. She wiped her hands, glanced at Noah, and nodded. Her heart already sensed something was wrong. In the office, Richard didn't offer her a seat. He stood by the window. The sky was grey, heavy. He looked nervous, but his voice stayed cold. "You've been effective, but there's been a shift internally. We'll be ending your contract." Maria froze. The world collapsed inside her. But she didn't show it. She simply whispered, "I understand." He handed her an envelope with final payment. His hands shook, just slightly. Maria took it calmly. Her eyes were too quiet for the moment. "Can I say goodbye to him?" "I think it's better if you don't." Richard looked away. He knew it would break him. And still, he stood firm, as if protecting himself mattered more than doing what was right. Maria didn't beg, didn't cry. She just nodded, walked out slowly, her worn-out bag over her shoulder. As she passed the kitchen, she looked at Noah one last time. He was still smiling, swinging a little toy in his hand. She swallowed hard, wanted to hug him, to say she'd be back, that none of this was his fault. But she obeyed. She left behind the boy who had called her Mommy, and carried in her chest a silence that would scream forever. Richard watched it all through the security cameras. When the door shut, he exhaled, leaned against the wall, cried softly. Because firing Maria wasn't really about her. It was about him, about the pain of failing as a father, and the cowardice of pushing away the one person who had done the impossible. Sometimes we push away what we love, because we're afraid we don't deserve it, he thought. But it was too late. When Alma found out, she walked into the office without knocking, looked him in the eye and said, "You just fired the only ray of sunshine in this house," and left, leaving Richard alone with the echo of his own decisions. That night, Noah went looking for Maria. He sat on the rug, waited, then walked to the kitchen, checked the cookie jar she always brought. empty. He climbed the stairs, went into her room, and sat on the floor, quiet, still, in his eyes, a silent question. Richard found him like that, but didn't know what to do. He just kneeled beside him, and in that moment, he felt something inside the boy begin to fade. And as Noah stared blankly at the floor, Richard finally understood. Some mistakes can't be undone with apologies, but with courage. And if he didn't find it soon, he'd lose everything, all over again. Noah went silent. For days, the house, once merely quiet, now felt lifeless. The drawings Maria had once taped on the walls were torn down, by him, shredded and left on the floor. The empty cookie jar had been thrown across the room with a force no one knew he had. With every wordless act of anger, Richard shrank a little more. He tried to get close, but the boy would turn his face away, or curl up in a corner, or simply disappear into himself. In her room, now just another empty space, the smell of Maria's simple soap still lingered in the air. One night Richard walked in, not knowing why. He sat on the edge of the bed, touched the pillow, and cried again. It felt like he'd ripped a hole through the house, a hole in his son, and another one, in himself. He knew what he had done, but he had no idea how to fix it. He tried to force the routine, called therapists, brought expensive toys. Took Noah for a walk in Central Park. Nothing worked. Noah just stared at the places where Maria used to be. He'd spend hours by the window waiting, touch the floor where she sat, and draw circles one after the other, over and over, as if trying to draw time backwards. At Stanford Enterprises, the board began to notice his emotional absence. Emails went unanswered. Reports were left untouched. But Richard didn't care. Nothing mattered anymore. One morning, in the middle of a meeting with investors, he stood up mid-presentation, grabbed his coat, ignored the stairs, and walked out of the room. He took the elevator down 40 floors, stumbling onto the sidewalk like a man fleeing a fire burning inside. His driver rushed after him, confused, but Richard was already behind the wheel, driving himself, something he hadn't done in years. He had one destination in mind, Maria's job application, the one he had tucked away in the bottom drawer of his office, like a secret regret. At the very bottom of the page, scrawled in blue ink, "Cleaning job, Mon and Wed afternoons." He'd never read that line, until now. But now, it was everything. He sped across the city, parked in front of an old public school, its walls stained, its courtyard cracked. He stepped out and walked fast. He didn't know what he'd say. His heart was pounding in his throat, and there, at the end of the hallway, he saw her, Maria, kneeling on the floor, gloved hands scrubbing tiles with an old rag, alone, invisible to the world, but alive and whole, and somehow more radiant than ever. He froze, couldn't move, stood there like a statue of guilt. She saw him, stood up slowly, took off her gloves, met his eyes. There was no anger in her gaze, just exhaustion, and a deep sorrow that said, "I knew you'd come." But why did it take so long? Richard swallowed hard, took a step, then another, and then, with every ounce of pride shattered, he knelt. The words came out torn. "I was wrong, and I hurt you, and I hurt my son. Because I was scared that he'd love you more than he loves me, scared I wouldn't know how to handle that. But now I understand. What you gave him was love, and I never should have taken that from him." Maria just listened, in silence, eyes full, heart shattered, yet aching to believe. At last, Richard reached out his hand, not as a maid, as a guide, as someone who understands my son better than anyone. As someone he chose. Maria hesitated, but in that moment, she saw something in Richard's eyes she'd never seen before, vulnerability and real love, and that's when she understood. True strength doesn't lie in the man who builds empires. It lies in the one who knows when to kneel. She didn't answer right away. just stared at Richard, on the floor of that school, surrounded by buckets and brooms. A man stripped of everything but the essential. The silence between them was heavy, but not empty. It carried stories, losses, feelings too big for words. Finally she sighed, lowered her gaze and said, "He waited for me, and you took too long." Richard swallowed hard. He was ready to hear it all, even the painful parts. She kicked off her rubber shoes, ran her fingers through her hair, and looked straight into his eyes. "I'll come back, but not for you. I'm coming back for him, and for me. Because when Noah called me Mommy, I realized something inside me came back to life too." Richard nodded. Pride melted. Suit soaked in sweat. For the first time, he wasn't the man in charge. He was the one who asked. And there, on that worn-out floor, his greatest transformation began. Hours later, Maria walked through the door of the mansion. Alma was in the living room. She dropped the tray she was carrying. "Oh my God, you came back?" Maria smiled, teary-eyed. "I came back, Alma, but not the same." She climbed the stairs slowly. Richard didn't follow. He waited below, like a man standing at the door of a sacred place. And then he heard from the bedroom a soft sound, followed by muffled laughter. Noah had seen her and ran straight into her arms. The boy threw himself at her without hesitation. Maria held him tight against her chest, eyes glistening. He buried his face in her neck like it was the safest place on earth. And Richard, watching from the stairs, placed a hand on the railing and closed his eyes. It wasn't envy anymore, it was gratitude, because now he understood. The love Maria awakened in Noah was also teaching him how to love. That night they had dinner together, for the first time, the three of them. No staff, no formalities. Richard burned the steak. Maria laughed. Noah spilled juice and no one cared. It was chaotic, imperfect, alive. Later they sat on the rug, making up silly sounds for the toys. Richard got the names wrong on purpose. Noah corrected him with gestures. Maria just watched. It was new to all of them. But it felt old, like it had always been meant to be this way. Before bed, Richard walked into Noah's room. The boy was already lying down, eyes open, holding his pillow tight. Maria sat beside him, softly humming. Richard walked in quietly. Noah reached out his hand. Richard took it. "Can I stay here?" Maria nodded. So did Noah. He sat on the floor, back against the wall, and stayed there until the boy fell asleep. Later, Maria appeared in the doorway. "Thank you." "For what?" "For listening." Richard smiled, tired. "Because of you. I'm learning." She didn't reply, but in the look they exchanged was something no company could ever measure. Respect, affection, hope. And that night, for the first time in a long while, Richard didn't dream of absence. He dreamed of his son's laughter, and he knew, without a doubt, he was exactly where he was meant to be. But fate still had one last surprise in store. One word, one scar, one legacy of love that would change everything, forever. It was 7 in the morning when Richard woke up with a weight on his lap. It was Noah. Fast asleep, his head resting on his leg, arms limp, as if all his defenses had finally dropped. Maria sat beside them, wrapped in a blanket, eyes half closed, quietly watching. Richard didn't move. He was afraid to break the spell. There, on the bedroom floor, he discovered for the first time what it meant to wake up next to someone, not out of duty, but out of love. Maria stood up gently and left the room. She let the two of them stay there, father and son truly, for the first time. Richard ran his hand through the boy's fine, messy hair. He thought about all the times he avoided that touch, all the moments he let slip away, and now, without warning, his son had thrown himself into his lap like he knew. He had found home. The CEO's heart thudded in his chest, and in that silence, he gave thanks, not with words, but with quiet tears. In the days that followed, Richard did the unthinkable. He stepped away from the company, appointed interim leadership, cancelled meetings. He wanted to be there, present. With Maria, he learned how to make pancakes and burn them. He learned to cut stars out of paper. He learned that a scream isn't met with control, but with listening. Noah began to respond, first with sounds, then gestures, and eventually with real, steady smiles. One afternoon, Maria suggested something bold, finger painting. Richard grimaced but gave in. Soon the three of them were outside in the garden, covered in paint, laughing like children. Noah painted his dad's face blue. Richard retaliated with yellow. Maria took a photo, and in that single click she captured more than a memory. She captured a transformation, because in that moment there was no millionaire, no maid, no special needs child, just three people trying to find each other. One afternoon, Richard had an idea, not a business idea, but one born from gratitude. He started writing letters to his late wife, not to say goodbye, but to share, about Noah, about Maria, about how he was trying, failing sometimes, succeeding a little. Sometimes he left the letter beside her photo frame, and each time he did, the pain hurt a little less. Because now there was continuity, not just absence. One night, after a long bath, Richard sat on the couch with Noah in his lap. Maria walked into the room and froze. The boy was sound asleep, and Richard, eyes closed, was humming something he'd heard from her, off-key, but sincere. When he opened his eyes and saw her, he whispered, "Thank you for teaching me how to be human." Maria just nodded, and in that simple gesture, their whole story pressed into one invisible embrace. Alma, the housekeeper, watched everything with teary eyes. She used to say that house felt like a vault, but now every corner had color, had sound, had life. Even the hallway, once dark, now had notes taped to the walls. Even the kitchen smelled like cake on the weekends. And the silence... oh, the silence had changed. It was warm now, shared, full of presence. Noah began wearing a new T-shirt Maria had bought him. On it, painted in crooked fabric letters, "Dad." Richard saw it for the first time while the boy played in the yard. He knelt down, touched the fabric, and pulled Noah into a hug. "That's me. I'm here, son, and I'm not going anywhere." And in that embrace, the CEO disappeared, and the father Noah had always hoped for was born. But there was something more, something Maria had been planning with Richard in secret, a gesture bigger than both of them, a gift, not just for their family, but for the world. And it would be revealed at the right time, on the stage of a brand new life. On a chilly fall morning, Richard walked into an unassuming building in Harlem. He carried a leather folder and a new sense of purpose. The place was old, but filled with the sounds of children's voices echoing through the windows. Inside, Maria waited with a name badge on her chest and eyes gleaming like a girl's. The walls were covered in artwork by autistic kids. A temporary sign at the door read, "Clara Stanford Foundation, Center for Support and Education for Children on the Spectrum." Richard didn't want speeches, no press conferences. The foundation carried his late wife's name, but its soul belonged to Noah and Maria. Here, children would be seen as unique, given time, given presence, given love. And most importantly, given respect for their quiet language. Maria was named director. She cried when she got the offer, then answered firmly, "Now, my pain makes sense." That afternoon, as the new staff received training, Richard stood off to the side and watched. Noah played in the yard with two other children, laughing, running. It was like watching him reborn. Alma was there too, holding a tray of lemonade and fighting back tears. "I swear, I never thought I'd see this." Richard looked at her and smiled. Neither did I. But there it was. That night, back at the mansion, Noah pointed to his father's bedroom. Didn't speak, just pointed. Richard understood. He set up an extra mattress and laid down beside him. Maria stood in the doorway, watching. Soft light, soft breath, full silence. Before turning off the lamp, Richard whispered, "Thank you, son." And then, unexpectedly, Noah turned to him and said, "Daddy." It was almost a whisper, almost a breath. But it was real. Richard's heart burst. Tears came without warning. He covered his face, fell to his knees. Maria walked in, kneeled beside him, and together they embraced the boy. Right there, on the bedroom floor, 3 lives sealed a journey that began in pain and bloomed in love. Days later, Richard wrote his final letter to his wife. It read, "He spoke, he laughed, he chose me, and I chose life. Thank you for leaving me this mission. We're moving forward with love. You are in everything." He buried the letter in the garden, beneath her favorite tree, a quiet testament, not of wealth, but of healing. And the mansion that was once silent now had music, voices, drawings taped to the walls, cookies in the oven, and yes, toys scattered across the floor. Richard was no longer a CEO. He was a father, a human being, someone who finally understood the difference between being rich and being whole, between status and meaning, between winning and loving. Tell us in the comments where you heard this story, and if it touched your heart, like it, share it with someone who needs to hear this, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.